Okay, before we get started, I just want to say that I'm covering the bosses from every single Spark game. That includes 1, 2, and 3, and even Fark's playthrough of Spark 1. With that being said, let's get started. Okay, at number 52, we have what I think is the worst boss in the entire Spark series, and that is Turbo Bird. Yeah, right off the bat, I'm just going to say most of the Spark 2 bosses are pretty low on this list, and that's because the combat in this game isn't that engaging. That being said, Turbo Bird also happens to have like one of the quickest fights with like the least engaging presence. The background is dull, his attack patterns are super predictable, and I just literally spam parry the entire way through. Not interesting at all, but I don't think this is a very controversial opinion. I'm not gonna lie, this boss just moves back and forth across the screen, from left to right, shooting spike balls. You can even avoid a majority of these balls if you just stay to the left of the screen like you see I'm doing here. Yeah, just a pretty lackluster boss. Literally the same as the last one, although this time he's a pirate and his bombs explode. Moving on. Yeah, I mentioned this guy a bit in my Spark Iceberg. Other than his lore and the funny dialogue at the beginning of the fight, he just tries to hit you quite pathetically and he dies super fast. Pretty anticlimactic final boss for the Mari Desert level. Sad. This one is really close with Turbo Bird, although the dialogue from EJ at the beginning is better than the one in Turbo Bird, and also it's the first boss in the game, so what am I gonna do? Put it as last in the list? Come on. Okay, I'll admit, this one's a bit more personal than it is the boss is bad, but I just really hate Romalo's personality in the Sparkulator Jester 2. Plus, Astra is a pretty wasted character, and this boss just goes to further prove that. I think her powers are cool with the way she controls the energy swords, but I mean, Float does it better. Just a disappointing waste of a character. Reginald Complex is already one of my least favorite levels in Spark 1, and boy, this boss does not help. I do think it's on the more unique side because it's attacking you from both angles, and you do get to, fight on different sides, but it kind of drags on for too long, and I died so many times in this boss to BS, I'm not gonna lie. Okay, so usually the moving bosses in Spark games are really fun to play. This, however, is not the case. Hanshi attacks you from the back, which normally would be fine if you weren't going to the opposite direction. This just makes it tedious because you have to deal with an auto-scroller as well as a boss shooting you from behind, and it's just really clunky to deal with. It does not feel good to play. Okay, for this boss, I feel like it's more of a mini-boss than anything. You'll see this trend with the beginning bosses of Spark 1 as they later become regular enemies that you fight throughout the level. See, here's a perfect example of this. Laos is an enemy I'm pretty sure you fight in Tower of Eos, and that kind of diminishes his uniqueness, if I'm going to be honest. Same goes for Aum. This is a boss you fight in Tower of Eos and is a regular enemy. Same thing for Gome. I'm surprised I even put these on these lists because these are more like mini-bosses if anything. Has a really annoying attack cycle where he goes off screen and you can't even hit him, where you have to dodge spikes from above. I really hate enemies where you're not allowed to attack them so that they can finish their really easy to avoid attack. Really lame. Sorry EJ, but you're just not that much of a fun boss. You kind of have a huge presence at the beginning of the game, but you get absolutely destroyed in one boss fight, and that's it, you get off-screen death. Pretty pathetic, I'm not going to lie. And another wasted character. Okay, here's where the bosses actually start to get pretty decent in my opinion. First, we have an honorable mention that I forgot to put on the list, the boss at the end of Terminal Dragon. I know this kinda doesn't count because it's like a mid-level boss and I would have to count the other bosses as well, but I feel like Terminal Dragon's the only fun one because it doesn't have a predictable attack cycle. Plus its design is really cool. But no, I'm not ranking the other level bosses in Spark 2. Okay, this one is a little bit lame, but it is technically the first boss fight you fight Fark in, but he controls a robot that has this weird blue misty hand attack you, and he summons enemies from the stage. Not a bad boss fight, but nothing too astounding either. I already mentioned how I don't like bosses you can't attack because of their attack cycle. Well, this one does the opposite. You can attack at any time, but it will hurt you to do so, so you have to use a ranged Jester ability. Combine that with the fact that it follows you around, and this boss is pretty unfairly difficult in my opinion, though it's not that bad. Literally the same boss fight, only this time there's lava and it chases you from under the ground, so it's even more wonkier to fight. Gosh, why did this thing make a return in Caria Valley? This is just a worse version of a better boss fight I'm going to mention later in this list. They tried to make its aesthetic more edgier than the first one, but that kind of made it turn into a more generic enemy instead of the unique aesthetic that the better boss fight had. Plus, this one is easier somehow. Look, Karana's design is just so cool, and the fact that her power is actually like a Jester power with the Archer ability makes this an actual cool rival fight of some sorts. But you find out that she's a good guy, so that's a bonus. Okay, I'm not gonna lie, one of the main reasons I put it this high is the fact that the robot commits seppuku at the end. But other than that, it's a pretty standard fight, although the lava attacks with the ground do make it stand out as being more flashy than other early on bosses. This is an actual good moving boss fight. Although its attacks are really predictable and make the fight drag on for just a bit, I like the underwater aesthetic of Karana Forest, so it adds to the atmosphere. The combination of funny dialogue and the actual reaction-based combat make this fight surprisingly good early on. I'm always surprised on repeat playthroughs how fun Tropius is to fight, especially with the fact that you can dodge through his rocks and stuff. It's pretty cool. Okay, the reason why it's the lowest on the B list is because it's a pretty disappointing final boss, I'm not going to lie. It's pretty easy all things considered, and the music and gameplay of this boss fight just kind of happen and go with the motions. There's no sense of epicness, just you fighting in the new form, which I don't really like that much, and it dying after you deplete its HP to 0. Weirdly anticlimactic. I feel like Flint's boss fight is way more serious in the context of the story, because unlike the other boss fights in Spark 2, Flint doesn't go down when you beat him, he just disappears. Add that to the fact that he's the boss of arguably the best stage in the game, and he's pretty difficult all things considered. I feel like Flint, as a character and as a boss, is just extremely well designed. Take all the things I said about the last one, but also make it have epic boss music with the backdrop being a rainy sunset city, and the fact that it progresses the story directly, and it comes after one of the worst boss fights in the game. Double is just a really intimidating boss, man. What can I say? Okay, so right off the bat, I'm just going to say that all of the Freon Dark bosses are going to be pretty high up on this list, as they're all really fun to play and they're super difficult, which adds to their uniqueness. As for Beast in particular, I feel like it's the worst of all of them, because it has a version previous to it that's just, it just sits there and dies, but this version is much better as it actually has really cool attack patterns, and the music that plays here is super epic, and it's the boss that introduces us to it. Just a nice solid first impression. I actually think Megagram is a pretty underrated character in the Spark community. His giant hammer and design looks absolutely sick, and his boss fight is pretty fun. It's decently challenging, and the aesthetic in the background as the storm rages on is just a nice tone to set for the fight. Really underrated. Okay, I'm not gonna lie, I actually kind of forgot this boss existed, but it's pretty unique for Spark 1. I think he only has 2 attacks that directly damage you, with a flash attack that prevents you from staying on the screen temporarily and risk you falling into the pit. Pretty cool boss and design in my opinion. Same goes for this one as well. I feel like this is the rare occasion where we actually get an organic creature to fight against instead of just another robot. Plus, its attack patterns and the double attackers and fark's playthrough really add to this boss's uniqueness. Another underrated gem. By far the best moving boss in the entire Spark series. You started off by fighting this on-rails vehicle that goes down really quickly, but just when you think the fight's over, a massive ship drops down upon you and you have to fight it by jumping into the air and slashing it with attacks. Just the presentation on that fight, as well as the music changing and the dynamic of it, just makes it super fun to play through. This is how you do a moving boss. Remember when I was talking about the better version of Leru? Well, this is that boss right here. The expressions and aesthetic of this are just pretty adorable, and I like the fact that it takes a unique idea of using a screen as the face of the enemy, but him controlling the environment. Pretty awesome. That, of course, isn't the only awesome boss from Litoria Bay, as I believe that this area is a pretty underrated stage, not gonna lie. Probably one of the best fights in Spark 2, which isn't saying much, but man, the music in this fight just goes so hard, and I actually like the fact that she transforms into a second form halfway through the battle. It just gives it a sense of epicness, like you're fighting an old rival. Really solid presentation on this fight's end. If it weren't for the fact that this boss had terrible controls, it would be much higher on this list. But man, the fact that it's a mech fight and the cutscene before it is just so cool, with it being exploded from the city and the fact that you control it with float and spark, it just screams epic, though it needs a bit more polish if it wants to be in the top tiers. Speaking of top tiers, it is at this point in the list where I say some of these fights become really, really good. I'm talking best in the franchise. Yeah, this one was pretty unexpected for me, because when I finished the final boss in Fark's playthrough, I actually expected it to be over, but little did I know we would get a whole brand new design for Freon at the time that looked absolutely sick. And though the boss itself isn't that hard, I feel like some of the other shadows were much harder to defeat. This boss just has a sense of epicness to it that the other ones don't really come close to, especially considering that it still has that banging music in the background. Now, you'd think this boss would be a bit lower on this list, considering the fact that you fight him a total of 3 times. But man, the music and presentation is just so epic. Every single time you defeat him, you get a cool animation of Spark, but if you lose the battle, it also equally counts as you progress in the story. It just feels epic to play. Plus the fact that I had no clue it was Flint of all characters, and his character design this time around is just absolutely sick. The idea of him going rogue after his entire trio just died before Fark in Spark 2 is really depressing, but also gives him a sense of epicness. You can really feel his rage with every single attack in this boss, and Spark 3 does a great deal to make its boss fights a ton more satisfying than Spark 2. Despite this boss's funny name, I think it's an excellent pre-final boss of Spark 1. This boss gives off a sense of 3D-ness that I don't feel like any other boss has, as I'm pretty sure the model for this robot is a 3D model if I'm not mistaken. Plus, when he gets out of the robot and he starts finally attacking, it becomes pretty challenging, I'm not going to lie, to dodge all of his attacks. And the end, when he grabs Spark in a fury of rage and threatens to kill him, just pure raw action. Not gonna lie, don't remember much about fighting this boss either, but its design looks sick, and the fact that you get to fight a super version of yourself that's a duplicate in the shadow form is just really cool to me. It doesn't look nearly as hard as the other virus bosses, or the one that came before it for that matter, but it definitely deserves a spot in the A-list as it's really good. Now, this version of Romulo has an actual pretty cool design. I like the fact that the robot mimics the first one that you fight him against, but it also adds some new attack cycles that are unpredictable. Makes it fresh and unique in my opinion. Plus, it has the color scheme of Sunset Forest, which you just got out of, even though it's called the Tower of the Yos. Pretty solid fight. Now, I remember I used to hate this boss. It boiled my blood. But now that I've played it so many times, I can surely say that it's a pretty epic boss fight. You start off in this corridor train with like the dead people that seem as slaughtered, only for him to turn into a massive dragon that you have to defeat. Gives this boss a sense of progression that no other boss really has in Spark 1 besides, you know, the top picks that I'm going to choose. Plus, Seam is another character that turns out to be a good guy in the end, so hey, that's a bonus. When I was just talking about a sense of progression in the bosses, we get to this thing. I just really like the fact that Romulo seemingly followed you all the way from Litoria Bay to this part of Kirana Forest, only for him to get absolutely destroyed by a giant saw right before your eyes, and have the only boss in the game where you can actually die to fall damage, interestingly enough. This fight just feels so intense on your first playthrough. Even though I kind of wish he mixed up the laser beams it shoots at you on the broken platforms to make it a little more difficult, I can definitely appreciate what Lake was going for in this boss, as you soar through the moonlight sky fighting a giant robot in the air as the logs are falling towards the ground. Gives the game a sense of epicness, and definitely was not expected in the first playthrough. Plus, that borderline orchestral music doesn't hurt either. When I was just talking about cinematic epicness, we cut to this boss fight. Man, the second fight you have with Fark is just so atmospheric. You start off by climbing up this giant tower, only to see Fark standing on top of the robot like a complete badass, with his back turned to you, warning you not to continue on your journey, or else there will be dire consequences. The boss fight itself is actually pretty hard as well. Not going to lie, I died a couple of times on my first playthrough, and I really had to focus on what to do in order to not completely get destroyed. Also, the fact that this comes right after probably one of the best levels in the entire game, Sunset Heights, makes this boss super memorable to any playthrough of Spark Electric Jester I come across. Alright, I know this is a fan favorite among the Spark fanbase, but it's pretty good. It's nostalgic, it takes all of the best special boss fights from Spark 2 and I think only Spark 2, and it adds them in a unique twist. But I'm not going to lie, this boss is just kind of recycled. It is better since the combat system of Spark 3 is much better, but we are just fighting Rhino Dino, EJ, and Double again with more epic music. So I can't put it up that high, but I can definitely see why people like it. Especially since it comes after Hysteria Historia, the best stage in the game. I bet most of y'all forgot about this fight. This is Laru Hollow form, which is the better Laru in my opinion. For me, this boss was completely unexpected when going through Metagraph Fortress. I didn't expect to come across a boss until the very end of the level, but then I get surprised with this mini boss, which somehow takes the concept of that weird mechanical thing, but turns it up by the fact that it has a set HP bar that you can't damage it past, which normally I wouldn't like, but the attacks are so fun to dodge and the aesthetics of this boss are simply gorgeous. Pretty unknown and underrated boss fight, definitely. Okay, it is at this point in the list where I say the boss fights in this game border on some of the best I've ever played in a platformer, easily surpassing some of the best in my opinion. As edgy as the name sounds, I just love this thing's design. I'm so glad it came back in the endless run of Spark 3, but I'm getting ahead of myself. The fact that it has a giant scythe that it can throw at you, making it kind of easy to enter your super form if you know how to parry correctly, just adds to this boss's dynamic fighting style. Add that to the fact that it comes right after your Calm Man, that extremely atmospheric fight, and you got yourself one exciting encounter to fight against. Man, I used to hate this boss fight, but the amount of difficulty and time it takes to beat it just makes me respect the hell out of it. It's so fun to fight. You have to parry every particle nearly perfectly, and every single attack you take has to be precise and well-intentioned. You cannot mess up a single time in this boss fight, and that just makes it feel more epic. Sadly, it's not even the final shadow, which makes me think the difficulty wasn't intended, but it's just too fun to play. You've made it, you all know who it is, it's Fark the Electric Jester. This boss fight just screams epicness. The fact that he brings out his super form just makes it feel like an anime battle, I'm not gonna lie. Plus the main theme playing in the background, while not the epic vocal music that I wish they would have played, just makes it stand out from the rest. Plus the fact that you have to hit him a set number of times instead of just depleting his HP, forcing you to go through all the phases of the boss that are really difficult if you're caught off guard, just makes this fight such a treat to play through. Almost as if it's a rite of passage saying, you finally made it to the end of the game. Now time to fight me in order to test if you're worthy. Reminds me of the Curry vs. Meta Knight fights you would always find in those platformers. Just the iconic rival battle between two opposing forces. Man, I know you guys weren't expecting Sawman to be up this high on the list, but it's just so cool. In the demo when I first played it, I was geeking out over how epic this boss was, with the cutscene presentation being shown to evolve from Spark 2, and the phases of this boss changing from it sitting on all fours to it standing up with giant saws in its hand. Just makes this boss iconic, what can I say? It's also a really good boss to test out your skills on, as you can see people speedrunning the hell out of it on YouTube. Not gonna lie, the presentation alone on this boss just carries it to this S rank. Definitely a banger first boss for Spark 3. We finally got to the final boss of Litoria Bay. I've already gushed about how much I love Romolo as a character in Spark 1, and this boss fight only solidified my love for him as, man, the fact that he uses holograms to attack is pretty unique for a robot, I'm not going to lie. It's a pretty unique application of nanotechnology and screams references to Matrix and stuff like that. Plus I like the final phase of this boss gives you this atmospheric moon battle with this giant mech robot. Lake really went all out for this character's boss, which happens in one of the most underrated stages of the game. Most people don't even talk about Litoria Bay, but man, he sure is a joy to fight. Romolo is just such a good character. Now this is an actual personal favorite boss of Spark 3. The fact that you start off the boss with arguably the best vehicle in Spark 3, the ship, only the transition to the fight on ground where you play as Float came as a complete surprise to me, and really just made this boss instantly iconic as it introduces the character of Float flawlessly into the narrative of the game. Simply an underrated masterpiece in my opinion. Now here comes the top 4 boss fights in the Spark series. Up first we have the final boss from Spark 1. Do I really need to say anything? It's the final boss. You have the epic music in the background, the Dragon Ball references, anime as hell atmosphere, and to top it off, the pretty dynamic setup as you have to go up the giant tower, destroying enemies that usually take you minutes beforehand. Though the fight itself does just boil down to you essentially spamming the attack button during Freon's high output attacks, this boss is just so cool, man. It definitely deserves to be up here as it's so fun to play on every playthrough of Spark 1 I've done. Now, I did talk bad about the Centralis boss fight of Spark 3 being anticlimactic, but boy, this one sure is not. The fact that you get to use Fark as you go up against Clarity who has corrupted Spark and turns into the beast that you fought in Fark's playthrough is not only a sick reference, but is also excellent at contextualizing Fark's narrative perfectly, as he now has to help Spark fight off the virus of Clarity. Top that off with the fact that the background music is epic as always, and the background looks stunning, and yep, this is easily SS material. For number 2 on this list, we have the ultimate final boss of Spark 2. Lake somehow made this boss even more anime than the first game's final boss, with the music this time around being a straight up opening theme of the final boss from the first game. On my first playthrough of Spark 2, I was simply awestruck by how epic it felt. Plus the fact that the combat in this boss is actually good this time around, as Freum has a lot of unique attacks, and though his design is ripped straight from Frieza from Dragon Ball, I feel like the ending of it is just really sick as he walks through the beam that Freon puts through him and punches a hole through him. It has the presentation of Spark 3 before he even started working on that game. Simply a masterpiece. And for number 1 on this list, thank goodness I played through that DLC of Spark 3 because man, Unit 1 is easily the best boss in the entire Spark franchise. The fact that it's a secret final boss adds to its mysteriousness, and it's a really difficult boss to fight, probably the hardest in the entire series. I came to respect it after I played it many times trying to record the video for it, and it's just so unique in every aspect. First, it has Centralis as a midway boss you have to fight for it. Second, it has the levels that are intertwined throughout the entire level that force you to focus on your energy drain and make sure you don't take too much damage. And third, it has probably the best presentation throughout the entire game, which is saying something, because Spark 3's presentation for all of its boss fights, given the fact that it shows an epic cutscene throughout each one, really goes to say something about this boss in particular. With the cherry on top being the absolute lore bomb we get at the end of it just being absolutely beautiful. For all of those reasons, and the fact that it takes the best aspect from every single boss fight on this list, I deem Unit 1 to be the best boss in all of Spark the Electric Jester. Thank you for watching, and as usual, be sure to tell me if my opinions hit or if they missed in the comments below. I am very interested to see what your thoughts are on this topic because it's not something that's usually talked about that much in the Spark community. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Peace.